The front door hadn't even finished swinging open before I heard my father's voice. "Put those boxes upstairs. Diane's kids can have the 2 larger bedrooms." I froze. 2 moving trucks filled my driveway. Men I'd never seen before carried furniture through the front entrance, while children raced down the hallway laughing as though they'd lived there for years. I had buried my husband less than 3 hours earlier. "Dad," my voice barely came out, "what is this?" Richard Bennett turned toward me with the relaxed smile he always wore when he'd already decided the conversation was over. "Oh, Claire, perfect timing." He slipped an arm around the woman standing beside him. "I'd like you to meet my wife." My mind refused to process the sentence. "My, what?" "We got married this morning." Before I could answer, Diane walked into my kitchen wearing my apron. She set a tray of coffee mugs on the counter like she owned the place. She smiled. "I'm running Daniel's bakery now," she said. "Someone has to keep it profitable." My heart lurched. "No," I said. "That's my bakery. Daniel left it to me." Richard's expression hardened. "This house and bakery belong to our family now." Then he pointed toward the staircase, as if giving directions to a hotel guest. "You can stay in the downstairs bedroom until Diane and I leave for our honeymoon next week." I stared at him, unable to believe my own father had waited exactly 1 day after my husband's funeral to replace my life with his own. And the strangest part wasn't how confident he sounded. It was how certain he seemed that no one could stop him. I couldn't help wondering, how had he become so sure he already owned everything? The smell of fresh flowers from Daniel's funeral still clung to my black dress. As I stepped farther inside the house, we'd spent 12 years restoring together. Only it no longer looked like our home. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway. Someone had already removed Daniel's favorite reading chair from the living room. A teenage boy I recognized, as Diane's oldest son was stretching a tape measure across our dining room. "Mom wants this wall opened up," he said without even looking at me. "Mom." He was talking about Diane, as if she'd always belonged here. I looked toward my father. "Tell them to stop." Richard folded his arms. "They're making improvements. This isn't your decision." "It is now." His calm voice frightened me more than if he'd shouted. Nothing about this felt impulsive. Everything looked organized, planned. The trucks had arrived with labeled boxes. The movers knew exactly where every piece of furniture belonged. Even Diane's children acted as though they'd memorized the layout before setting foot inside. They hadn't moved into a stranger's house. They'd arrived expecting possession. Diane opened one of my cabinets and frowned. "We'll probably replace these dishes," she said casually. "They're a little outdated." I walked toward her. "Take off my apron." She glanced down at it, then smiled without moving. "I'll need it tomorrow." "For what?" "The bakery opens at 6. "I'll be opening the bakery." She shook her head gently, almost pitying me. "No, Claire, you'll need time to grieve." Richard stepped between us. "That's enough." I stared at him. "You can't seriously believe you can move people into my house 1 day after Daniel's funeral." "Our house," he corrected. "My wife deserves stability. My husband isn't even buried 24 hours. His face didn't change. "Life moves on." Those 4 words hurt more than anything he'd done so far. Daniel had spent years building Bennett Bakery with me. Every loaf of bread, every birthday cake, every recipe scribbled onto stained index cards. We had worked before sunrise, survived slow winters, celebrated record holidays, and finally paid off the last business loan together. Now my father stood in our hallway acting as though all of it belonged to him, simply because he'd decided it did. As I looked around, something else caught my attention. Richard wasn't asking permission. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't even pretending this was temporary. He spoke like someone following a plan that had already been approved. Then a memory surfaced. 3 days before Daniel died, he'd squeezed my hand from his hospital bed. His voice had been weak, but unusually firm. "Claire, promise me something." I promised. At the time, I thought it was simply the fear of a dying husband trying to protect his wife. Standing in my own house, surrounded by strangers carrying boxes upstairs, I suddenly realized Daniel hadn't been speaking out of fear. He'd been speaking with certainty. Why had my husband been so sure someone would come for everything he left behind? Introduction complete. Hit Go to continue. Chapter 1. 3 days before Daniel died, the hospital room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines of light across his blanket. Claire sat beside him, holding his hand with both of hers, trying to memorize every detail of his face. Daniel looked exhausted, but his eyes were unusually focused. "Claire." She leaned closer. "I'm here. I need you to promise me something." She smiled softly, trying to lighten the moment. "You've already made me promise to keep baking your sourdough recipe." A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing. "This isn't about bread." His tone made her stomach tighten. "If anyone," he paused to catch his breath, "anyone at all, even your father, claims they should run the bakery after I'm gone." Claire frowned. "My father." Daniel squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't agree to anything." She nodded automatically. "I won't." "No." He shook his head. "I need you to understand exactly what I mean." His voice dropped lower. "Don't sign anything. Don't make verbal agreements. Don't let anyone convince you it's temporary." Claire searched his face. "Daniel, why are you saying this?" He looked toward the hospital window, instead of answering immediately. "Some people mistake grief for weakness." The sentence hung in the room. She wanted to ask another question, but the nurse entered to check his medication, ending the conversation. Daniel never explained what he meant. At the time, Claire convinced herself he was simply trying to protect her from making emotional decisions. She never imagined he was warning her about someone specific. Now, standing inside the house that no longer felt like hers, those words echoed through her mind. Some people mistake grief for weakness. She watched Richard directing movers, as though he'd hired them weeks earlier. "That dresser goes upstairs," he instructed. "No, not that room. The master bedroom." Claire's head snapped toward him. "The master bedroom." Richard looked at her calmly. "Diane and I will be sleeping there." Claire stared at him in disbelief. "That was Daniel's room. It'll be ours now." The sentence landed like another funeral. As evening settled over the house, Claire slipped quietly into Daniel's office. It was the only room the movers hadn't completely invaded. She opened the bottom filing cabinet. Empty. The second drawer. Empty. She frowned. Daniel kept every important document in color-coded folders. Business licenses. Insurance policies. Ownership papers. Tax records. Several folders were gone. Not misplaced. Gone. She searched every shelf before hearing footsteps behind her. Richard stood in the doorway, holding a glass of iced tea. Looking for something. Claire closed the drawer. "Where are Daniel's files?" "What files?" "The bakery documents." "Oh." He shrugged casually. "I moved them somewhere safe." "Where?" "You don't need to worry about paperwork right now." "I asked where they are." Richard took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "I'll handle it." The answer came too quickly. Too smoothly. He'd expected the question. Dinner was stranger than Claire could have imagined. Diane's children filled the dining table, laughing about schools, neighbors, and paint colors. Claire barely touched her food. Halfway through the meal, Diane disappeared into the hallway. When she returned, she was carrying framed photographs. Claire immediately recognized them. Her wedding photos, pictures of Daniel, family vacations. Without asking permission, Diane placed them in a cardboard box. Then she replaced them with glossy wedding photographs taken earlier that morning. Richard and Diane smiling. Richard cutting a cake. Richard slipping a ring onto her finger. Claire pushed her chair back. "What are you doing?" Diane looked genuinely surprised. "I'm decorating. Those are my family pictures. They're in storage." "You packed them away. We're starting fresh." Claire walked across the room, lifted one of Daniel's framed photographs from the box, and held it tightly against her chest. "No one asked you to erase my husband." The room fell silent. Richard sighed dramatically. "Claire, no." She looked directly at Diane. "This was my home before breakfast." Diane folded her arms. "It's our home now." Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Claire locked herself inside the downstairs bathroom. It was the only room with enough privacy to make a phone call. She searched through her contacts until she found the number Daniel had insisted she save months earlier. Margaret Ellis, attorney. Her hands shook as she dialed. The phone rang 3 times. A receptionist answered. "Ellis Legal. My name is Claire Bennett." "Yes, Mrs. Bennett. I need Margaret immediately." "I'm sorry. Ms. Ellis is returning from an out-of-state hearing tomorrow afternoon." Claire closed her eyes. "I can't wait. I'm afraid she's unavailable until then." Claire lowered the phone. Tomorrow. She only had to survive until tomorrow. The next morning, she walked downstairs to voices drifting from the kitchen. She stopped before entering. Richard wasn't alone. 2 of her cousins sat at the table drinking coffee. "She's devastated," Richard was saying with a heavy sigh. "I'm worried she's not thinking clearly." One cousin nodded sympathetically. "That's understandable after losing Daniel. I've offered to manage everything until she gets back on her feet." Claire stepped into the room. "I'm standing right here." Both cousins looked uncomfortable. Richard smiled warmly. "There she is." Claire looked from one relative to the other. "What exactly have you been telling everyone?" Richard answered before either cousin could speak. "That you're grieving." "I am grieving." "Exactly." His smile never disappeared. "Which is why someone has to make responsible decisions." Claire finally understood what he was doing. He wasn't just trying to take the house. He was building a story. One where she was too emotional to be trusted. One where he looked like the responsible father stepping in to save his broken daughter. If enough people believed that story, no one would question anything else. Richard walked past her toward the front door. As he reached it, he leaned close enough that only she could hear him. Then he whispered with absolute confidence, "By tomorrow, everyone will believe this was always my house." Claire barely slept. Richard's whisper repeated in her mind every time she closed her eyes. "By tomorrow, everyone will believe this was always my house." When dawn finally broke, she drove straight to Bennett Bakery. The familiar brick building had always been her safe place. Daniel used to joke that she smiled differently the moment she smelled fresh bread coming from the ovens. That morning, something felt wrong before she even reached the front door. 3 employees were standing outside instead of working. They looked confused. One of them, Maria, hurried toward Claire. "Thank goodness you're here." "What happened?" Maria glanced nervously through the front window. "She's inside." Claire didn't have to ask who. She pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed. Every conversation inside the bakery stopped. Diane stood behind the front counter, wearing a crisp white chef's coat embroidered with the words *General Manager*. Claire had never seen it before. "Good morning," Diane announced cheerfully to a line of customers. "I'm Diane Bennett. I'll be managing Bennett Bakery from now on." Several customers smiled politely. Others exchanged puzzled looks. Claire walked straight toward the counter. "What exactly are you doing?" Diane didn't even lower her voice. "Running the bakery. You have no authority to be here." "I disagree." Claire noticed the office door standing open. Inside, boxes were stacked against the wall. Her desk had already been emptied. "My office?" Diane nodded casually. "We're turning it into a conference room." Claire felt her pulse rise. "You packed my office. I had to make space. You touched confidential business records. They're perfectly safe. They weren't yours to touch." The employees stood frozen, looking between the two women. Nobody knew whose instructions to follow. Before Claire could say another word, Richard entered through the front door. He smiled warmly at everyone inside. "There she is." He walked toward Claire with the exaggerated concern of a loving father. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't be working today." Claire stepped back. "I'm exactly where I belong." Richard turned to the customers. "I hope you'll forgive my daughter." He lowered his voice just enough to sound compassionate. "She buried her husband yesterday." The bakery became silent. Several customers looked at Claire with sympathy. Richard continued. "She's insisted on coming in, but she's exhausted." "I never said that," Claire interrupted. He ignored her. "Diane and I agreed someone needed to keep the business running, while Claire has time to heal." An elderly customer nodded. "That sounds reasonable." Another quietly said, "Poor thing." Claire realized what was happening. Richard wasn't trying to win an argument. He was controlling the audience. Every sentence painted him as the caring father. Every objection she made risked making her appear unstable. She forced herself to stay calm. "I appreciate everyone's concern," she said clearly, "but I own this bakery." Richard gave a patient smile. "We'll discuss ownership privately." "No." Claire looked around the room. "We'll discuss it right here." Richard reached into a leather folder and removed several papers. He lifted them just high enough for everyone to see. "As you can see, we're handling the estate properly." Claire stepped closer. "Let me see them." "They're legal documents." "I know. I'll show them to the proper people." "You just waved them in front of customers." A brief flash of irritation crossed Richard's face. Then it disappeared. "Now isn't the time." Claire reached toward the papers. Richard folded them shut before she could read a single line. "Enough." Customers began whispering. One woman quietly asked another, "If he has paperwork, maybe he's telling the truth." Claire's stomach tightened. Richard hadn't actually proven anything. He'd only created the appearance that proof existed. And for many people, that was enough. The lunch rush finally eased. Employees drifted into the kitchen, still unsure whose orders to follow. Maria approached Claire carefully. "I need to tell you something." Claire nodded. "What is it?" Maria lowered her voice. "About 3 weeks ago." Claire listened. "I came in early to prepare dough. And I heard your father talking on his phone in Daniel's office." Claire frowned. "He said something that didn't make sense." "What?" Maria hesitated. "He told someone they'd be investing in his bakery before the end of the month." Claire stared at her. "Are you sure?" Maria nodded immediately. "I remember because Daniel was still alive." Claire felt cold. Richard hadn't invented this takeover overnight. He'd been promising ownership while Daniel was still fighting for his life. The realization changed everything. This wasn't grief. It wasn't desperation. It was planning. That afternoon, Claire finally arrived at the downtown office of Margaret Ellis. The attorney greeted her with a firm handshake. "I'm sorry for your loss." Claire placed every document, photograph, and note she'd collected onto Margaret's conference table. Then she described everything. The wedding, the moving trucks, the bakery, the missing files, Richard's public claims. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Claire finally finished, the attorney organized the papers into neat stacks. She asked only one question. Has Richard publicly claimed ownership of both the house and bakery? Claire blinked. Yes. In front of witnesses. Customers, employees, family members. Margaret slowly closed the folder. To Claire's surprise, she smiled. Not because the situation was funny. Because something had just been confirmed. Claire leaned forward. What does that mean? Margaret locked her briefcase. It means Daniel expected this. Claire's heartbeat quickened. You knew. I knew he was preparing for a specific possibility. What possibility? Margaret stood. The one your father just created. She picked up her briefcase and walked toward the door. Then she looked back at Claire and said quietly, now Daniel's final instructions can finally be activated. Claire followed Margaret into the hallway, struggling to keep pace. What do you mean, Daniel's instructions can be activated? Margaret pressed the elevator button, but didn't answer immediately. The less you knew before today, the better. Claire stared at her. My husband planned for this. He planned for the possibility that someone would try to take advantage of you before the estate was fully administered. The elevator doors opened. Margaret stepped inside. Now they've acted publicly. That changes everything. By the next morning, Margaret had filed emergency motions with the court to prevent any transfer, sale, or alteration of the bakery's assets until ownership was officially confirmed. Before the bakery even opened, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. Employees stopped what they were doing as the deputies entered carrying official folders. One deputy addressed the room. Until further notice, no ownership changes, financial transfers, or management authority may be exercised without court approval. Richard's face turned red. This is ridiculous. The deputy remained calm. Sir, we're here to preserve business records. Richard pointed toward Claire. She's destroying this family because she can't accept reality. Claire didn't answer. Margaret had already warned her. Let the documents speak. The deputies requested access to financial files, supplier contracts, payroll records, and business licenses. Richard confidently stepped forward. I'll show you where everything is. One deputy looked at him. Are you an authorized officer of the business? Richard hesitated for the first time. No. Then please step aside. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, Richard looked like someone who wasn't in control. As investigators began comparing the business records with Richard's public claims, questions surfaced almost immediately. His name appeared on none of the ownership documents. He wasn't listed as a partner. He wasn't an officer. He had never been authorized to manage the bakery. Yet he had introduced himself publicly as its owner. Margaret quietly organized every inconsistency into a growing file. Claire watched from across the office. Each page seemed to chip away at the confidence her father had displayed only days earlier. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing inside the house. Claire returned that afternoon to collect more personal belongings. She stopped when she heard raised voices coming from the living room. I don't understand, Diane said sharply. Richard lowered his voice. Keep it down. You told my children this business was already yours. It will be. A phone rang. Richard answered. His confident expression disappeared. No, I told you funding would be secured this week. He listened. I'm handling it. Another pause. No, don't call the house again. He hung up. Diane folded her arms. Who was that? No one. It didn't sound like no one. Richard rubbed his forehead. Just a lender. Claire remained hidden behind the hallway wall, listening. A lender? Diane asked. Richard sighed. I borrowed against future bakery income. You borrowed money. It was temporary. You told me you already owned the bakery. I said I would. Diane's voice rose. Those aren't the same thing. Claire quietly stepped back before anyone noticed she was there. The conversation confirmed something Margaret had suspected. Richard hadn't simply lied to Claire. He had built his entire future around property he didn't own. Later that evening, Margaret called. We've gained access to Daniel's secure records. Claire drove to the attorney's office immediately. Margaret unlocked a fireproof document box and carefully removed several sealed folders. Daniel wanted these opened only if your father attempted to claim ownership. Claire's hands trembled. Inside were dated letters, financial statements, and printed emails. The first letter was addressed to Margaret. It described repeated conversations over the previous several months. Richard had asked Daniel to transfer partial ownership of the bakery. He claimed it would keep everything in the family. Daniel refused every request. Another folder contained emails. Some were from Richard. Others were responses from Daniel. Again and again, Richard pressured him. Again and again, Daniel declined. Then Margaret opened the final sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Daniel's handwriting was unmistakable. Claire swallowed hard as Margaret read aloud. If Richard moves into the house immediately after my funeral, he is trying to establish possession before legal authority is confirmed. Do not argue with him. Let him make his claims publicly. Claire looked up. He knew. Margaret nodded. He anticipated exactly this. The letter continued. Daniel explained that confronting Richard too early would only allow him to adjust his story. Instead, Daniel had instructed Margaret to wait until Richard publicly represented himself as owner. Only then would every false statement become evidence. Claire slowly folded the letter. Daniel hadn't left her revenge. He'd left her protection. The court hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Richard walked into the courthouse wearing an expensive suit and the same confident smile he'd worn while moving strangers into Claire's home. He greeted relatives in the hallway. Everything will be settled today. Several family members nodded. They still believed him. Claire entered with Margaret beside her. She carried one envelope. The final envelope Daniel had prepared. Only Margaret knew everything inside it. Richard glanced at it but laughed quietly. Still chasing paperwork. Claire didn't answer. The courtroom doors opened. Everyone took their seats. The judge entered. Richard straightened his tie, ready to explain why the house and bakery belonged to him. He had barely opened his mouth to speak when Margaret rose from her chair. Your Honor, she said evenly, lifting Daniel's envelope into view. Before the defendant makes another ownership claim, the court needs to see what Daniel Bennett prepared. The courtroom fell completely silent. Richard slowly lowered his hand from the table. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, he looked uncertain. Margaret stepped forward and placed a thick, sealed packet before the judge. Your Honor, these documents were prepared by Daniel Bennett 3 days before his death. They were executed in accordance with state law and held under attorney supervision until a specific condition occurred. The judge adjusted his glasses. And what condition was that? Margaret answered without hesitation. Mr. Richard Bennett, publicly claiming ownership of property he did not legally possess. Claire watched her father's expression change. Only slightly. But enough. He hadn't expected Daniel to plan ahead. The judge broke the seal and began reviewing the documents. Page after page. No one spoke. The only sound in the courtroom was paper turning. Finally, the judge looked toward Richard. "Mr. Bennett." Richard immediately stood. "Yes, Your Honor. According to these trust documents, operational authority for Bennett Bakery transferred directly to Claire Bennett upon Daniel Bennett's death." Richard forced a smile. "There must be some misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding." The judge continued reading. "The trust specifically excludes any transfer of authority to extended family members." Richard's smile disappeared. Claire felt years of tension leave her shoulders. The bakery had never been vulnerable. Daniel had protected it. Margaret wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there is a second packet." She handed another folder to the court. Inside were notarized statements documenting multiple meetings during Daniel's illness. Each statement described Richard pressuring Daniel to surrender ownership of the bakery. The judge read silently before asking, "Mr. Bennett, did you repeatedly request ownership while your son-in-law was receiving end-of-life care?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I was only trying to help." Margaret calmly responded. "The written correspondence tells a different story." She submitted printed emails, one after another. Richard asking, Daniel refusing. Richard insisting, Daniel refusing again. The pattern couldn't be explained away. Then came the documents Richard never imagined existed. Margaret produced copies of emails and loan applications Richard had sent months earlier. She highlighted one sentence. "Once ownership transfers, I'll control both the bakery and Claire's residence." The judge looked directly at Richard. "Did you represent to lenders that you already had authority over these assets?" Richard swallowed. "I expected to." "That wasn't my question." Silence. The judge repeated it. "Did you tell financial institutions that you would soon own property you had no legal interest in?" Richard looked toward his attorney. There was no answer to give, because the emails spoke for themselves. Diane's face slowly lost all color. She turned toward Richard. "You told me everything was settled." Richard wouldn't look at her. "You said Daniel wanted you to take over." Still nothing. "You told my children we'd be living in a house that belonged to us." Richard quietly whispered, "It was supposed to." Diane leaned back in her chair as though she'd been physically struck. For days, she'd believed she was building a new life. Instead, she'd been living inside someone else's deception. Margaret presented the final document, Daniel's handwritten letter. The judge allowed her to read it aloud. "If Richard claims ownership before legal confirmation, do not stop him. His own words will become the strongest evidence against him." Another paragraph followed. "Claire will be grieving. She may doubt herself. Remind her that preparation defeats manipulation." Claire lowered her eyes. She could hear Daniel's voice in every sentence. He hadn't spent his final days thinking about revenge. He had spent them making sure she would never have to fight alone. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't born from loss. They came from certainty. After reviewing every document, the judge reached his decision. The court recognizes Claire Bennett as the sole lawful successor to Bennett Bakery under the terms of Daniel Bennett's trust. He continued, "Mr. Richard Bennett possesses no ownership interest in the bakery or the residence at issue." Richard closed his eyes. The judge wasn't finished. The court also finds sufficient cause for further review regarding possible financial misrepresentations made to lenders and private parties. Richard's attorney quietly placed a hand on his shoulder. The confidence that had carried Richard through the previous week vanished completely. The legal consequences came quickly. Creditors who had extended loans, based on Richard's promises, demanded immediate repayment. Several investors withdrew after learning he had claimed ownership of assets he never possessed. Civil claims followed. What Richard believed would become his financial rescue instead became the source of overwhelming personal liability. Outside the courthouse, Diane stopped beside Claire. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Finally, Diane took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." Claire remained quiet. "I believed everything he told me." She looked down. "I thought you were refusing to let the family move forward." Claire answered honestly. "I never blamed you for believing him." Diane nodded sadly. "I do now." Within days, she moved out of the house with her children. The marriage that had begun less than a week after Daniel's funeral ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Her children left carrying only the belongings they had brought. Nothing else had ever belonged to them. The family slowly learned the truth. The relatives who had accepted Richard's version of events began calling Claire. One by one. Some apologized awkwardly. Others admitted they had mistaken her quiet grief for weakness. Claire accepted the apologies that felt sincere. She simply declined to argue about the rest. The facts no longer needed defending. Returning to the bakery felt different. Employees greeted her with hugs instead of uncertainty. Maria smiled as she handed Claire her apron. "I kept this safe." Claire laughed softly. "I was wondering where it went." The ovens warmed the kitchen exactly as they always had. The familiar scent of fresh bread filled the building. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, the bakery felt alive again. Not because anything had changed inside the building, because the people inside it knew the truth. Claire gathered the staff before opening. "We're not changing Daniel's recipes." Everyone smiled. "He built this place with all of us." She placed his handwritten recipe card into a simple wooden frame and hung it above the main preparation table. Every morning afterward, it reminded the entire team why integrity mattered more than shortcuts. Months passed. Business grew stronger than ever. Customers who had watched the public dispute returned, many making a point of supporting the bakery after learning what had happened. The house gradually became peaceful again. Claire unpacked the family photographs Diane had boxed away. Each one returned to its original place. Daniel's favorite chair went back beside the living room window. His books returned to their shelves. The home once again reflected the life they had built together, not the future someone else had tried to force into it. Richard lost far more than the lawsuit. He lost the authority he believed came with being the family patriarch. His reputation, built on confidence and control, collapsed under documented facts. The same certainty he had used to intimidate everyone became the evidence that exposed him. Claire, meanwhile, discovered something Daniel had understood long before she did. Strength isn't found in raising your voice. Sometimes it's found in waiting until the truth can speak for itself. As she locked the bakery one quiet evening, she looked up at the familiar sign bearing Daniel's name. She smiled, not because she had defeated her father, but because the life she and Daniel built had survived the betrayal exactly as he intended. The day my father thought he had inherited my future became the day he lost everything he tried to steal, while the life Daniel built remained exactly where he intended, with the person who had built it beside him from the very beginning.